Welcome to the Library of Ideas, produced by the Academy and Institute for Scientific and Educational Thought. In this sixth episode, we travel to 15th-century Italy, to the narrow streets where marble and money first met, and where modern capitalism quietly began to breathe. In 15th-century Italy, the city was more than a place to live. It was a machine for invention. Florence, Venice, and Genoa stood apart from the feudal kingdoms that surrounded them. Independent republics whose wealth flowed not from fields or fealty, but from movement, ships, trade, and the rhythm of numbers inked in ledgers. Here, the merchant replaced the knight as the engine of history. Florence wove its fortunes in silk and wool. Venice commanded the sea routes to the east. Genoa lent its gold to kings and empires. Their independence from monarchs allowed them to build a new form of power, one measured not by lineage, but by calculation. In their markets and counting houses, a new human type appeared, the uomo d'affari, the man of business, who turned reason, risk, and order into virtue. Yet these cities were far from secular. Their palaces rose beside cathedrals, their bankers funded both crusades and convents. Faith and finance lived in a state of creative tension. To lend, to trade, to invest, all were actions tinged with guilt, yet redeemed through patronage, charity, and civic beauty. The Renaissance merchant believed he could serve both God and gain if his profit served the public good. He built chapels and funded painters as readily as fleets and banks, a sign that in his world salvation could still be purchased, though not in coins alone. In this balance between devotion and ambition, the first outlines of capitalism took form. The Italian city became a living experiment, a crucible where commerce, art, and faith shared the same streets, and where the pulse of trade began to sound like the heartbeat of civilization itself. Sometimes thought needs silence to unfold. If these ideas find a place in you, perhaps stay a little longer. Subscribe and walk with the Library of Ideas. There's much more waiting beyond this page. Let's turn it together. In a moment. For much of the Middle Ages, money was treated as something suspicious, a necessary evil, tolerated but never trusted. The merchant's gain smelled faintly of sin, and the usurer's coin was called the devil's metal. To touch gold was to risk touching temptation. Yet in 15th-century Italy, this moral equation began to change. Wealth no longer stood in opposition to virtue. It could, under the right conditions, become its servant. Florence led this transformation. The Medici and other banking dynasties turned finance into a form of civic devotion. They lent not only to merchants, but to popes and princes, and then channeled their profits into hospitals, libraries, and churches whose domes still rise above the Arno. Money, once feared as sterile and corrupting, began to regain its dignity by serving a higher order. It became a means, not an end, an instrument of faith and beauty, a tool through which capital and conscience could cooperate. The banker ceased to be merely a manipulator of numbers. He became a moral mediator, a man who stood between heaven and earth, translating divine harmony into human enterprise. This moral rehabilitation was revolutionary. It proposed that profit could have a spiritual dimension, that earning and giving were not opposites, but two movements of the same soul. In this emerging theology of economy, greed was no longer defined by possession, but by misuse. Money, purified by intention, could serve the divine plan as much as a sermon or a painting. To spend well became an act of faith, to invest wisely, a kind of prayer. Well, the Renaissance thus reconciled faith and finance, sanctifying the ledger and redeeming the coin. It prepared the ground for a new world, one where spiritual worth and material success could, for the first time, coexist without shame. When the Franciscan friar Luca Pacioli published his Summa di Arithmetica in 1494, he did far more than describe a clever accounting trick. He changed the moral geometry of the world. The system of double-entry bookkeeping, long practiced in the Italian trading houses, became through his pen a complete philosophy. Every transaction written twice, every debit mirrored by a credit. every gain balanced by a loss. What might seem a technical method was, in truth, a moral revelation. In the Renaissance imagination, numbers were not sterile abstractions, but reflections of divine harmony. The ledger was no longer just a business tool. It was a mirror of conscience, a quiet theatre where human actions were weighed and recorded. To balance one's accounts was to imitate the justice of heaven, where every wrong seeks redress and every excess finds its opposite. The merchant's desk became a moral altar, the pen a confessor's instrument. Each entry was a reminder that integrity demands symmetry, that prosperity without accountability is corruption disguised as success. This discipline of balance reshaped the European mind. It taught that order, not chaos, governed human affairs. That proportion was not only mathematical, but ethical. From the page of the ledger grew a new habit of thought: responsibility, transparency, and the conviction that truth must be measurable. Historians often call Pacioli's treatise the intellectual twin of the printing press. Both spread a new grammar of reason, a method that replaced intuition with verification and chaos with correspondence. In one, the word became reproducible. In the other, morality became recordable. Well, double-entry bookkeeping turned arithmetic into ethics and commerce into conscience. It made visible a theology of balance, a faith that the world, like the ledger, could remain just so long as every act was answered, every account settled, and every soul, in the end, brought into harmony. In the world of the Italian Renaissance, wealth ceased to be a pile of possessions guarded by custom. It became movement, a living current of money, goods, and ideas. The merchant no longer measured fortune by what he owned, but by what he could set in motion. Capital was reborn as energy, a force that multiplied itself through time, risk, and imagination. To possess was less noble than to create, to circulate was wiser than to hoard. This marked a decisive break from the feudal mentality, in which wealth was rooted in land, blood, and inheritance. Renaissance Italy discovered that value could grow through intellect rather than ancestry. The banker, once a mere custodian of old treasure, became a creator of new opportunity. The successful merchant was not born to privilege, he manufactured it. Investment became an act of both calculation and courage, a wager on the unseen future. To lend, to build, to trade, was to trust one's reason as much as one's faith. Time itself entered the moral and mathematical logic of value. Profit was no longer the reward of privilege, but the harvest of patience. Risk ceased to be a sign of greed and became a virtue, the proof of daring, foresight, and hope. This transformation made capital something psychological. It mirrored the human spirit. Restless, inventive, unwilling to stay still. Wealth no longer lay buried in chests or sealed in land deeds. It pulsed through contracts, ventures, and trust. Well, the Renaissance thus invented economic dynamism, a civilization where prosperity depended not on inheritance but on initiative. Capital began to resemble the human soul that created it, seeking, striving, and always in motion. What had once been gold in a chest became an idea in motion. Wealth transformed into a verb, not a noun. In that shift, Europe discovered that fortune favors not the powerful, but the imaginative. Among the many figures of the Renaissance, none embodied its paradox more perfectly than Cosimo de' Medici, the banker who ruled Florence without a crown. His wealth financed not only trade, but cathedrals, libraries, and the workshops of genius. In him, the merchant became a philosopher, and profit became a kind of stewardship. To lend to princes, popes, and painters alike was not mere ambition, it was vocation. The Medici understood that fortune carried obligation, the sacred duty to balance heaven and earth through generosity. They turned money into a moral instrument. By funding art, learning, and faith, they transformed finance into a ministry of civilization. The same coins that paid for voyages and treaties also raised the dome of Santa Maria del Fiore and illuminated the manuscripts of humanists. Wealth, in their hands, became a form of light. This fusion of commerce and conscience redefined what it meant to be a banker. He was no longer a hidden manipulator, but a custodian of civic harmony, a patron of order, beauty, and knowledge. The ledger and the altar became two halves of the same faith in human potential. Well, this was not hypocrisy, but conviction. The Medici did not worship money, they consecrated it. They believed that wealth without generosity was sterile, and that capital achieved immortality only when it built something greater than itself. In this sense, they invented what we might call cultural capitalism, a system where prosperity must justify itself through service. The banker's virtue was measured not by what he owned, but by what he sustained. The Florentine banker thus foreshadowed the later civic and Protestant ethic of work. Success defined not by opulence, but by contribution. God's banker was not a contradiction, but a calling. The Renaissance ideal of a man who counted his virtue with the same precision as his florins. The Italian Renaissance did not merely invent banking or bookkeeping, it reimagined the moral architecture of human action. Economy became a form of art, a way to harmonize spirit and matter. In workshops and counting houses alike, humanity ceased to be the passive subject of divine providence and became its collaborator, a co-creator of order through reason, precision, and imagination. The ledger, once a humble record of debts and credits, gained metaphysical weight. It mirrored the conviction that every deed must be answered, every act balanced, every gain accounted for. Accounting evolved into a silent theology of responsibility, the belief that moral order could be made visible through numbers, and that precision was a form of virtue. Each balanced page reflected the same harmony that builders sought in domes and painters in perspective. This union of mathematics and morality gave rise to a new humanism, one that found truth through structure and holiness through discipline. The same mind that painted angels in perspective also balanced the books of God's bankers. Both were acts of faith in human reason as a divine instrument. The Renaissance taught Europe that beauty and order could coexist, that balance was both aesthetic and ethical. It replaced superstition with method, chaos with proportion, and showed that the rational spirit could participate in creation itself. To keep one's accounts was not only prudence, it was prayer in numbers. Well, the Renaissance thus marked the dawn of modernity, a civilization that found sanctity in structure and freedom in responsibility. Its ledgers and manuscripts were twin testaments to faith in order, proof that the human mind could mirror divine balance. In that harmony between the soul's longing and the mind's order, the modern world was born, built on ink, faith, and the eternal rhythm between measure and mystery. Thank you for listening to the Library of Ideas, a project of the Academy and Institute for Scientific and Educational Thought. New episodes of the History of Economics in 25 Scenes appear every Wednesday and Saturday, your steady rhythm for reflection and rediscovery. Join us next time for Episode 7, Antiquity and the Middle Ages. The Moral Origins of Economics, also released on YouTube under the title What We Learned from the First Economists. We'll return to the beginnings, to the thinkers who saw wealth not as possession, but as a question of justice and the good life. Until then, keep thinking, keep questioning, and remember, even balance sheets owe their origins to philosophy.